Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by UNA, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barnard. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Kris Lance. Kris is Vice President and General Manager at UNA, a group purchasing organization that provides the Sourcing Hero with its home. Kris joins me every month to tackle a current news story or a topic of interest from his own point of view. So, hey, Kris, welcome to June.
Here we are. How you doing, Kelly?
I am doing just fine. Now, this week, we're actually going to take on a topic that is not necessarily a surprise at the high level, but has sort of an interesting twist.
Mhm.
You know, when we think about semiconductors, which are in everything, and everyone has been very aware of the concerns about shortages, we certainly think about Taiwan, right? Taiwan semi dominates this market.
Right.
And we think about the complexities of their relationship and our relationship with China. You know, the US has kind of made a play, but it's a long-term play with the CHIPS and Science Act. But the person or the group that nobody is talking about is Japan. They're a primary supplier of chemicals, packaging materials, and tools, all used in the creation of semiconductor chips. And in fact, companies located within their border account for half of the 6 crucial semiconductor materials that are needed. I was really surprised to read a story on this because Japan was not a country that I had found in sort of tier 1 conversations about semiconductor shortages.
Mhm.
What's your current understanding of the overall situation with these global semiconductor supplies?
Yeah, it's pretty similar as yours, I think. So I look at the semiconductor industry right now, kind of like as a whole, kind of like its mini version of like the space race.
Yeah.
And I say that though because I think just about all countries realize the importance of semiconductors as we look into the future, whether it's AI, just tech in general, what have you, right? I think I read an article not too long ago about China's position, right, on how important they think it is. And I think their stance was that the leader of semiconductors as a whole will essentially be in a position to lead the world for like the
Yeah.
next 75 to 100 years. So yeah, to your point, like governments, they're pulling out all the stops. And I think you and I could probably agree that's a large portion, if not entirely, the posturing that's going on between Taiwan and China and that friction. Um, you do bring up a good point though, because the less talked about or like the less sexy element of this is Japan, right?
Yeah.
But I look at Japan as kind of like, well, geez, I'm surprised it's catching me off guard as much as it is, because it's almost the equivalent like of having a car without tires if you have a semiconductor without all the other critical parts. And that's where Japan sits. Like they are that powerhouse globally, leading on those items. And what another layer I think of the complexity or the importance of it all is like Japan's economy is not, there's not a lot of economies doing well, but I think
Yeah.
theirs is on the ropes. So they're kind of, from what I can piece together or understand it, it looks like they kind of are going all in. Like they have to either maintain or grow in this space.
Well, and it's interesting, like when you talk about going all in, now certainly we know that China does not have a capitalist economy,
Right.
right?
Right.
They have sort of the half private, half government ownership structure.
Yeah.
And I think from what I've read, Japan's economy is closer to ours, but this is an area where they're investing incredibly heavily.
Hmm.
In fact, they're investing almost 1% of GDP
Jeez.
simply in semiconductor industry suppliers because they view it as a matter of national security. They are way ahead of us in terms of viewing, to your point, Kris, you need the tires for the car to be worth anything.
Yeah, right.
So no, they're not Taiwan, and they're not producing the final, 4 nanometer chips that are so in demand. But they recognize that if they can become a crucial part of the manufacturing supply chain for semiconductor chips, that is what's going to earn them a seat at the table as the United States works to make ourselves more independent of China on this front. At the same time, I think they're realistic and they recognize that, yes, funding, but if you also want innovation, it can't just be the government. And so you need to strike this balance of public sector funding with private sector competition and innovation. And I'm curious to know from your perspective, whether it's the case example in Japan or whether it's chips and science in the US, where do you typically stand on government subsidies of industries?
Well, so in general, like if I look at the definition, or like how I'm defining like government subsidies, it's like money that like a government, right? Or someone's going to be paying like an organization or an industry to like reduce its costs or essentially put them in a position where they can provide new or updated products or services. So like most things, like on its face, I'm like, yeah, sounds good, I guess, but how does that really work? So it's kind of in the middle. I guess I'm kind of waffling on the answer. But I'll say, like, to be frank, I don't really have any faith in, I'll say, in the US, like our current leaders' ability to manage a budget or really anything with finances. And let me be crystal clear, that goes for both sides of the aisle. I mean, I think there's this quote, right? Like if you put the government in charge of the desert, they'll run out of sand. And so maybe you're just catching me on a
we
blank
have to
page.
quote Reagan. Hold on. This is the perfect moment. I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
I'm here to help.
Please stop helping me.
Yeah, scariest words you can hear. So again, it's a long way of saying, like, anytime I hear government and money in the same sentence, I just cringe so hard. But that said, like if I'm Japan, I mean, I see the importance. I understand if they're looking at this as essentially the lifeblood, not of a company, not of an industry, but the lifeblood of their country. I mean, I do get it. Back to your initial question though, right? Like personally for me, circumstances need to be pretty extreme or dire to really be on board with it. I tend to be more of I'll say a free market purist or free market individual. But I do understand the position that Japan is taking on this because it is their lifeblood. But again, that's kind of it for me. It's the extreme of Japan's nature that would make me kind of give the nod versus I don't think we should, but like you've already touched on, I think that CHIPS Act is already signed and in motion. So
exactly.
Yep.
And it is interesting because, yes, there's private innovation and competition. Yes, there's public sector funding. But really, the thing that's sort of writ large across at least this particular manufacturing supply chain is the high drama of geopolitics. And the really interesting Brookings Institute article that I had read in preparation for today, and they sort of analyzed the dramatic geopolitics associated with this particular situation, looking at relative strengths in the market. And basically, it comes down to if the US, South Korea, and Japan can't find a way to play nice on semiconductors, they will absolutely never be able to move this supply chain away from China. China will remain dominant. And there's been a little bit of past turbulence here. They talked about an example from 2019, if we can remember life before 2020, where there was a disagreement between Japan and South Korea, and they threatened to stop supplying any of the companies in South Korea, which includes Samsung, because of this dispute. So they're willing to sort of throw their weight around, even though they're not making the final chips, they're making all of these critical components. And in fact, there are some materials that Japan has something like 50 plus, 80 plus market share around. Jeez. So they have 88% of the global market share for the coder or the developer machine it's related to the wafers, 53% of the silicon wafers themselves, and 50% of the photoresists, one of the chemicals used in making semiconductor chips. And we've seen examples of this, right? We just watched what happens with baby formula when you have too few companies that have too large a market share. We've seen this in pharmaceuticals We know it's an issue with semiconductors when you look at the finished product. I mean, Taiwan Semi is dominant globally, and they're just one company.
Mhm.
Now, the twist here is that when we think about regulations, especially IP related regulations, that's where the focus tends to be. But that's
Mm.
not where Japan is. Japan, like we said, they're making the tires, they're making the packaging, they're making
Mm.
some of these base level materials and processors. And those are far less likely to be restricted in terms of legislation. So they are managing to kind of keep this dominance and fly below the radar. So
Interesting.
when I think about some of the different strategies, we can talk about nearshoring, right, where we move it closer to home. We can
Mm.
talk about friendshoring, where we move it to some other place where we get along with the folks that live there. Any of these sort of shorings. But in my opinion, anytime materials are this concentrated, we've allowed ourselves to be put in a bad position.
Mhm.
When we try to apply this across sourcing, across general supply chain management and market understanding, how are we supposed to process this kind of information and start factoring it into our strategies?
Well, you signal some really interesting dynamics, especially between like the allies and like I'll call them less friendly countries. Like,
Yeah.
so for example, we're talking about all this posturing, and I don't mean to squirrel real quick, but when you mentioned South Korea, the first thing that popped into my head is, huh, well, are China and North Korea getting cozy then? Because there's some very interesting things going on happening with North Korea as well, and so when you start, I guess where I'm going with this is when you factor in semiconductors in general, and then you start looking at the players in the space, but then also when you factor in the semiconductors role in just different military applications, it's just
Yeah.
for me, I just needed to say like the world certainly gets small in a hurry.
Yes.
Now, back to the question, like how should supply chain leaders and decision makers process this kind of information? But the first thing is don't panic, right? Because it's impossible to eliminate risk entirely. But what you can do is mitigate it and have contingency plans in place. Honestly, I think just based off what you said, that kind of sounds like what Japan is looking to do. But I think I think they're just looking to manage their risk around this with more intention than they have before.
Yeah.
So if I'm a tech leader in supply chain, I'm doing the same thing. I'm diversifying my sourcing of capabilities. Actually, I would argue I've probably already been working on that for quite a while. I've said this
What was your
before about
phrase? Have a plan C? Was it a
yeah,
plan
you
C
got
or a plan
exactly. You
D?
remembered. You
Yeah.
remember. You have to, right? Not just a
Yeah.
plan B for the plan A, but a whole like, hey, that whole plan was just blown up. Like, let's go look, have something, a path to march down before something even happens. Because at this point, we're talking about just geopolitics in general. I don't even think it really matters what line of work or industry you're in. Like you were just touching on baby formula, like
Yeah.
my how soon we forget, but I think you'd almost be kind of foolish though to not be watching these things and almost assuming that you should always have a backup plan, already established. And if you don't and you're listening, well, go get one started, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
wait for a situation to present itself to essentially try to solve for it.
Yeah. And maybe a small comment of levity in what's an otherwise extremely serious conversation. You mentioned South Korea, North Korea.
Mhm.
I have to give so much credit to South Korea because this is sad, Kris, but it's true. I've been following this whole situation where the North Koreans
The
are
balloons.
filling bags with, let's just say, fecal matter,
Oh my
tying them
god.
to balloons and floating them over the border to South Korea. Not
Mhm.
pleasant, right? But also sort of 13 years old,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And South Korea's response, not sending bombs back, right? Not trying to reverse the wind and blow the balloons back over. They have been blaring Korean pop music. And from what I understand, it is basically the equivalent of take your pick and sync, right? One
Oh
of these
wow.
bands, they are blaring it on speakers in retaliation. I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
So there is a possibility for a little bit of good-natured humor and response here, right? Not everything needs to be a total escalation.
Right. Oh,
But
it's
even Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, no, I saw that article,
I'm
and at
so glad
first
you've been following the
I had to
balloons
think.
too. I'm glad it's not
Well, no,
just
I
me.
saw it and I thought like, "Oh, am I on like a parody link? Like what?" I thought it was a joke
Oh,
until I
no.
really saw they're literally filling up balloons with stuff and
I
just
know.
sending it. So, but yes, good on South Korea for not escalating the situation and finding, I guess, a way to troll them right back on the same level. So,
And yet it's funny. So within this one brief conversation, we've
mm,
gone from semiconductors, we've talked about some of these different international relationships, we've talked about different industries where
mhm,
these same dynamics are playing out. It seems like so many different spheres of life keep pulling towards each other. So we always have geopolitics. There's always incentives that exist within private industry. There's always innovation, a lot of which happens internationally, especially if there's an academic component to it,
mhm.
and even business ethics. It seems like every topic we discuss in procurement and supply chain seems to lead us towards the third rail. And I'm wondering whether or how we will know when we need to sort of pull ourselves back and actually start thinking bigger. I mean, not that tracking these balloons is necessarily going to improve our sourcing strategy, but the dynamics behind them. I guess we're probably approaching the point with November on the horizon, especially of not being able to say, well, I'm just in procurement, I'm just in sourcing, I'm just in supply chain. I don't want to deal with these dynamics.
Mhm.
Uh, do you think we need to start thinking bigger and finding a way to appropriately bring some of these dynamics into our conversations?
That's the thing is, so first of all, yes, absolutely. And I think it I think it's starting to change. Like to your point initially, it was almost like a lot of topics were untouchable, and now it's almost like we have to bring some of these topics to the forefront of conversations just to make sure that you're adequately prepared or have a plan in place. Um, I still think there's quite a few people who struggle in not being able to see the forest through the trees.
Yeah.
For example, like I'll say it, I'll own it. I've said about economists before, just because you have or manage money doesn't mean you're not an idiot. But the thing is, people are convinced of what they're convinced of.
Right.
So here's what I do, just for anybody listening, and it's like, well, how would you hold up the mirror to yourself? Um, whatever you're convinced of, go do real research, but actually try to prove yourself wrong.
Mm,
Don't go to your trusted sources, go to your opposite sources. 'Cause when you look at something with a competing lens of your bias, all you are really left with are facts, right? Because you're going to dismiss all of the emotion that you're not attached to. And so what I keep hearing even still sometimes, I would encourage those who say like yeah, but we're too big, or yeah, but our contracts say, or yeah, that would
yeah.
never happen. I would say ask yourself, what are you trying to do? Because that's actually one of the easiest questions to ask, but one of the most difficult to really answer. And I think as you start to answer that question of what are we trying to do, if you stay curious while you answer that, you'll see where your risks are, or you may even end up with just an entirely different perspective on the situation itself. So back with kind of how you asked the question or framed it to me, I think the devil is always going to be in the details, but there is certainly very real wisdom in just slowing down and taking a step back.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've actually been really impressed, especially over the last few months. It used to be if somebody said to you, I don't mean to get political, but
Hmm.
it was sort of like saying, no offense, but you knew there was an insult coming.
Right. Yep.
And somebody would say, I don't mean to be political, but you knew there was a political statement
Yeah.
coming. I'm finding that increasingly someone will say, I don't mean to get political, but, and then they say tariffs, or they say pending regulation in Germany, or
Mhm.
they say elections in the EU that are going to change the structure of our international operating structure.
Right.
It's topics that are very, I don't know, polarizing, divisive, but I really do feel like as the pressure seems to be building, it's bringing everyone's mind into focus.
Mm.
And so we're getting, yes, I'm wading into an area just to say right up front, we all may be a little bit uncomfortable, but then what follows it I am finding is increasingly well thought through,
Mhm.
increasingly necessary to be discussed. It's almost like we're getting our courage to talk about some of these things and to be forgiving of each other because we're not all going to agree, but to really try to work out solutions to some of these tough issues. It actually gives me a lot of hope that as we get through the rest of this year and as we get into 2025, we can sharpen our skills and our perspective, stay focused, but hopefully keep that ability to have these hard conversations,
Mhm.
dotted with light moments about South Korean pop music. But we do have to be able to talk about these things.
Yep, absolutely, and well said, because I forget the exact quote. It won't be verbatim, but bad things happen, I'll say, when people stop talking.
Yes.
Real bad things happen. And so the humanity and the very real connection of just having these conversations, and rather than turning away and walking away, leaning in and finding, that's what made the country what it was, is being able to disagree and wrestle through things to get to a similar or a desired outcome together mutually. And so I agree. I think if we can get more back into that, we got a fighter's chance. So
Now, Kris, I always so enjoy these conversations, and yet I always know there may be somebody that's just finding our monthly chats for the first time, that's meeting you for the first time. If this is somebody's first time hearing you, listening to an episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast, what would you suggest they do in terms of next steps for connecting with you, learning more about Una?
yeah. Well, if you want to learn more about Una, and I think you should, just go to una.com, una.com. You can go to About Us if you want to see who's on the team. I'm surrounded by incredible people that are better than me. But if you want to get in touch with me, you can mash my face, and I think you can get to me that way. But I also am on LinkedIn. It's Kris with a K. There's not a lot of us. And then Lance, Lance.
Thanks so much, Kris.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.